So welcome to the Keeping It Together podcast. I'm Lindsay Croshoe, and we're back today to continue our conversation about biking and bikes. So recall Bridget was interviewing me for the last two episodes around my experience. So take a look at those two videos if you want to backtrack and hear some of those stories. Today, we have a special guest, Patrick Lucas, who founded the Indigenous Youth Mountain Biking Program in British Columbia back in 2011. Thanks so much for joining us today, Patrick. I'm wondering if I can hand it over to you to give us an overview of who are you and what's this program all about, and then let's have a chat.
Absolutely. Thanks, Lindsay. Thank you, everyone, for having me on. It's an honor to be here. So I started the Indigenous Youth Mountain Bike Program back in 2011, 2012. At the time, I was working as a community planner with First Nations all around BC. And I'm not Indigenous myself. And so I was kind of flying into these really remote communities and remote places around BC and quickly realizing I was part of a system that was, for the most part, not really designed to help First Nations. I realized I was a part of the problem as an outsider. And I'd be, in all these meetings with Indigenous leaders and elders talking about the things that their youth and their community were facing, sedentary lifestyles, growing concerns around drugs and alcohol, a growing epidemic of suicide, and feeling like I really didn't have anything of value to offer them. And it all changed for me. I was in a small community called the Boothroyd Indian Band. That's what they call themselves. They're a Lakutmuk interior Salish people in the Fraser Canyon. And I was in a meeting with their leader and their elders. And in the middle of it, I heard a soft sort of voice whisper in my ear and said, "What do you know about mountain biking?" And it was an elder from the community. He was asking me, because I always showed up to these meetings with a mountain bike on my car. I would go for rides after the meetings. Is kind of how I kept my sanity. And the elder said to me, "It's like, our kids are doing it. They're riding all over the place. We can't leave a pile of dirt without these kids building some silly looking jump out of it." At one point, they were digging soil away from the fire hydrants around the community because that's where they could get good soil that they could build jumps out of. And you'd go around the community and see all the hydrants would be leaning over askew. And the elder told me, "We don't want them to stop. It'd be nice if they stopped taking wood from my wood pile and my fences to build their jumps and their features, but we want them to stay outdoors. We want them to be active. We want to build them a bike park. Can you help us?" And of course, I said yes. But I didn't know anything about building bike parks or anything like that. But I sure as heck wasn't going to say no. So I reached out to a bunch of people in the community, the mountain bike community in the Lower Mainland that I was starting to be a part of at that time. And we returned to the community and we worked with them over 2 days to build a little bike park for the youth, little pump track and some little jumps and learning features. And it was just an amazing experience. I'd been working with that community for about 5 years at that point, and this was the first time where just everybody showed up. Everybody came out to work together, and the kids particularly worked for 10 hours a day for 2 days to build their little bike park. And it completely changed my relationship with the community. Everybody opened up to me, started telling me stories about their community, about what they wanted for their future. And I realized I was onto something really special. And that's why I became a planner. And that's the kind of level of impact that I wanted to have. So inspired by that, I started the Indigenous Youth Mountain Bike Program. And at the time, the whole idea was just, use it as a means for building relationships and, getting communities to open up to me. And it completely blew up on me and grew up into something much bigger than I even imagined at that time. So since then, we've worked with around 40 communities, First Nation communities all over the province. And what we've actually largely have become is, at that time, we'd be working with communities and they would, we'd do riding clinics with the kids, we'd build a little bike park, and the elders and leaders would say, "Well, thank you, that's great, but there's nowhere for the kids to ride." In First Nation communities, the reserve communities were very much designed like prisons. They were to keep people off the land and to sever their relationship with their lands. So often there was the only place to recreate or ride your bike was on a busy road right through the middle of the community. So what we ended up doing is we started building trails. We would train youth to build and design trails in and around their community and on their territories. And then we would teach them how to ride those trails and kind of start operating as like guardians on the land kind of approach to it. So we built close to 100 kilometers of trail all over British Columbia, and trained hundreds of kids to be trail builders, some of who have gone on to become professional trail builders. And for me, it's really been a vehicle to explore what it means to be a non-Indigenous person living on Indigenous lands, and to be an aspiring ally, to work in a way that isn't perpetuating the system that is kind of oppressing them to begin with. So that's us in a nutshell.
That's a pretty great story.
Yeah, real cool.
Inspiring. I have lots of questions, but when you mentioned building the trails and and connecting to land, and that speaks to sovereignty and having a place again and a role. I'm wondering about, how colonizers have renamed the land with, whoever was there to like stake a flag on there was named, and all these mountains were named after various peoples. Are the communities naming these trails in cool ways?
Yes, they are. And that's often one of the first conversations we have with folks. For example, I was working with one community, the Simpk. They're a Secwepemc community up by just northeast of Kamloops. And right from the very beginning, we were talking about, we should name the trails in Secwepemc. Like we should have some like traditional names. And they often talk about it. And that's one community where they're revitalizing their language. They're rebuilding their language. So we're always having that conversation. But a number of the communities we work with have started to name the communities, name the trails. And some of the local mountain bike clubs that we work with have also started to build relationships with the First Nations and are actually starting to rename some of their trails in Squamish or Secwepemc or what have you. So we're starting to see that. But with Simpk, it was funny because after years of kind of poking my friend Tom and saying, you really should come up with a Secwepemc name, the last trail we built together, I asked him, I was like, okay, what are you calling the trail? And he said, we're calling it Trim the Bush.
Thanks for that. I really appreciate that Trim the Bush name. I would say that in terms of resistance and indigeneity, humor is a big part of how we see the world. So I was hoping there would be names like that, and that's awesome.
Yeah.
Any questions that you guys have, Bridget and Adam? I'm going to hand it over to you guys for a moment.
I think I was wondering, with the pandemic, because this is what this podcast is about. I'm wondering if you could speak to how the course of the pandemic may have affected things. How you were running your program.
Absolutely. The pandemic had a huge impact on our program and the communities that we work with. So as most places, it was in March of 2022, 2020 rather, we were gearing up to have a really big season. We had a lot of projects lined up, many communities that we were going to be working with for the first time, and the pandemic hit, and everything got shut down hard for about 3 months, where we weren't moving at all and we weren't really doing much of anything. But what was interesting during that time is we were watching what was happening in the communities with Facebook and some of the apps that we follow, Strava. And we realized pretty early on that a lot of the folks in the communities where we had already successfully built trails and had trail programs going, they were using the trails quite consistently throughout that period and throughout the rest of the pandemic as well. But we realized quite quickly how important the trails were for them and their ability to get out, to go for rides, to go for hikes, to get out walking. So that was really confirming for us about how important our program is that it basically gives a platform in which these communities can, continue to manifest their healing journey. So that was really important. And we'd actually seen this before, because for us in 2017, 2018, we had, back-to-back record-breaking wildfire years. And a number of the communities that we worked with were really hit by the fires and were evacuated and were living in evacuation centers in Prince George. And it was afterwards that they started to come back to us and tell us about how the trails helped their communities to respond and to deal with that crisis. Now, those communities had done a lot of things to be more healthy and resilient, but they credited trails as being a key part of that. And the other part was that when they came back to their communities, even though the fire had ravaged the landscape around them, the trails hadn't been lost. So they really they celebrated that. And that's what brought people back. And then we actually got sponsored by the Red Cross and spent the next 2 summers training youth as a part of the fire response process. So when it came to the pandemic, we were kind of thinking, this is going to be a good thing for a lot of these communities. And it absolutely was. They were able to get outdoors. They were able to remain healthy and active. And that just keeps everyone healthy overall. And we really found out how important it is for mental health. So after about 3 months, we were among the first projects that started getting back invited into communities, because many of the communities that we work with here in BC, they were fully locked down. Like, they would have the roads blocked off and people were not allowed in. So we were very lucky that we got to go into the communities because they were doing the activities outdoors. And a lot of the kids, like, this was supposed to be their last year of high school. You know, they were supposed to be basketball stars. They were supposed to be having the year of their lives, and all of that had been canceled. And we found the trail building and the biking gave them something that they could process those feelings through, that they could manage those emotions and their stress. And it became a really important strategy for the community overall. And since then, I mean, the number of communities that are approaching us and asking for similar programming has just gone through the roof. Like, we really can't keep up.
Yeah, I think it's so important that
That's great.
Different communities had this ability to, be able to go outside and relieve their stress in healthy ways where they weren't, transmitting potential, illnesses. So I actually wanted to mention, since this episode is the follow-up where we're bringing in some aspects of primary healthcare and health-related resources, I did want to mention, you were saying that this was a great way for the kids to reduce stress. And especially during the pandemic, I feel like everyone's levels of stress were just absolutely skyrocketing. So I wanted to mention, like, this is backed by science. Yeah. So this study, I'm not going to pronounce the name properly, but we'll link it in this episode. It's Calogieri et al. 2021. So this study found out that there are absolutely stress-reducing benefits of exercise, and it's even greater when it's done outdoors. So activities such as biking, skiing, things where you're outside are even better than the activities that you could do inside. So I can see how this would be super beneficial to those kids in these communities, and I'm really happy that you were able to get back into those communities and you were one of the first people to do so, because I think that would be extremely helpful for a lot of kids.
I just wanted to chat about the nature of trails. I know that there's a lot of structure required to bike in good ways, right? I mean, it sounds like the kids were making their own structure, which I think is super cool. And there's also the health benefits of working together to build structure to make places to exercise. Some of the research in my diabetes world from Ganawage out east. Some of the ideas of trying to be healthy and prevent diabetes was like, well, you had to build some infrastructure, right? They had to build some walking trails, and some of the trails had to be built up above the marshy ground. So there's a lot of community sort of engagement to support each other and build it, and that built wellness and togetherness, and that was super cool. I wanted to acknowledge that, and I'm intrigued. So I'd love to hear more about that and how communities out here in Alberta can partake in the same and learn. I do a lot of hunting as well, and there's a difference between those people who are on trails and they're like going to a mountain peak, right, versus when you're hunting and you're meandering and it's like you're just sort of flowing with the land. And when I'm mountain biking, I feel the same way. I'm flowing, and it's not like the direct route from A to B. It's like you're going in areas because you want to go there, and people have intentionally gone to those areas because they're pretty cool, right? Little ups and downs and corners and stuff. And then when I'm on the land, I don't feel like I'm hiking, right? I'm hunting. I'm like I'm flowing with the land. And I felt the same way often when I'm on a great mountain bike trail, just flowing around and realizing, hey, this is like doodling around the mountain. It's not like going straight up and I'm like powering up and trying to beat a record. I'm just like I'm doodling. I'm meandering. And I think that's a whole host of ideas of wellness that I just wanted to fly by you and get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think you really touch on something so important there. And that's really something that both when we're teaching kids to build trails and we're teaching them to ride, my good friend Tom is always hammering the kids about this. Like, really think about where you're at. Like, in terms of like building a trail, you're not just hacking a path through the forest, you're creating an experience. It's landscape art. We're building playfulness into it, we're building that sense of connection into it, that the trail becomes a transformative experience. And I think usually the kids kind of roll their eyes to begin with, but as they see the trail emerging behind them as they're building it, they start getting that sense, and it becomes something that they're incredibly proud of. We'll have an event, like we had an event in Simc, the community I've been talking about, and people came from all over the world to ride the trails. It was called the Allies Mountain Bike Festival, and I remember a bunch of the kids who had built the trails, they all showed up, and just the pride on their faces as they kind of walked around high-fiving everybody, and they're like, yeah, I built that trail. I built that drop, and you see them out there playing on the trail and they're hitting every little rock. Like it creates a real sense of mindfulness and just being in the moment that I think a lot of kids can kind of lose out on in terms of the types of recreation and entertainment that we have nowadays. I think it can be so powerful.
There's a consistency of connecting, right? I often wonder about hikers, Western hikers. They want to conquer that hill, conquer that mountain, and they move on.
Mm-hmm.
With my experience of being on the land, I often go to the same spot every time and look at the same trees, but come from different angles. So I built this deep connection with with the foothills in southern Alberta, the Porcupine
Mm-hmm.
Hills, where my reserve has timber limits, and that we go hunting and do lots of stuff there, as well as all of the other places that we go out to the land. But go back there consistently, and I know the flow of the land, and sounds like when kids are they build a trail and they know the ins and outs of that space. That's a deep connection, right? Not a move along connection, which I see. I think it's important to do big hikes and all that kind of stuff, but I think there's this need to like be closely connected to a space and know the nuance of it and appreciate it, and having those little drops or those rocks or those trees or those roots, all of that is like, I think builds like some huge wellness. So I just wanted to point that out. That was like, that's astounding to me. And anyway, I'll pause there because I lost my train of thought.
Yeah, I think we could go on about that at length. And I mean,
Yeah.
I couldn't agree with you more, like, especially that creating that deep sense of connection to that place. We didn't set out on this program to build trails. It was something that was brought up to us. But now I couldn't imagine any different way of doing it, because building the trails is where riders get out of that Strava sort of, obsession. That's where they really start to slow down and really start to appreciate the experience that they're having.